Okay, back with our review for black, Theros Beyond Death for limited. Let's just start with Agonizing Remorse. It's Thoughtseize for 2 mana that can also take a card from their graveyard, which is kind of nice against escape, but that doesn't seem like it's going to be super relevant. You only lose 1 life instead of 2. You exile the card instead of discarding it. Again, a little bit nice because of escape, but I think all of that adds up to not a particularly playable limited card. I give this like a D. Thoughtseize just isn't that good in limited. Um, it's always a 1-for-1 where you've spent more mana and your opponent's limited cards just tend to be more interchangeable. Plus, it can whiff if they don't have any spells in their hand, which happens a lot more in limited than constructed. So, yeah, I don't really like this card. I'm gonna give it a D minus. Ephemia the Cacophony, 2 mana, 2/1, flying, legendary enchantment creature. Already pretty good stats for limited. And at the beginning of your end step, you can exile an enchantment from your graveyard to make a 2/2 token. That is really good. I don't think it's going to be super easy to get a lot of enchantments in your graveyard, but like this card is already good without that ability. If you can even get one, it's very good for 2 mana. If you can get two, and I think often you're going to be able to get one. I mean, not like super often, but reasonably often. You're going to have enchantments, probably mostly enchantment creatures that your opponents are going to want to kill or need to kill. Being able to get extra 2/2s, while by the time that happens, an extra 2/2 isn't the biggest deal in the game, it's still pretty good. I'm going to give this a B minus. Like, the extra 2/2s aren't super impactful, but it's not that easy to get them, but the card is already pretty good to start with. So, Aspect of Lamprey, enchants a creature you control. It is a Mind Rot, and enchanted creature has lifelink. This, you really need to not get blown out from your opponent casting instant speed removal or bounce. But if you can resolve it, it's mostly a 4 mana Mind Rot, which is not that great, but it's not that horrible. Giving lifelink is kind of meh. And it has a higher setup cost than normal Mind Rots, so I think I'm pretty low on this. I think I'm in the D range. But maybe, I mean, it's got to be a little better than Sealed, probably. Mind Rots typically are. And maybe you can board it in sometimes. Let's move on to Bright Breath Catoblepus. 6 mana, 3/2, not good stats. But when it enters, you get to shrink an opponent's thing, XX until end of turn, where X is your devotion to black. So you're probably going to have at least 2 devotion from this. And I think realistically you can expect to have maybe around 2 devotion more by the time you're playing this. So you can kill most things that your opponents do. So 6 mana, 3/2, kill an opponent's thing unless it's a bomb or if your board's pretty wiped out. I'm still not the highest on this, but if you can kill a creature, it's a 2-for-1, which is pretty good. I think it asks for just so many hoops, though. You can usually kill a big thing. I'm going to give it a C, but I'm very unconfident. Let's move on to Cling to Dust. Exile target card from a graveyard. If it was a creature card, you gain 3 life. Otherwise, you draw a card. Well, you'd much rather draw a card than gain 3 life. Exiling a card from your opponent's graveyard doesn't seem that good. You can escape this later to kind of make it a 2-for-1. Kind of like that blue card that we saw earlier, right? You need your opponent to have multiple non-creature cards in the graveyard to be able to do that, though, or you just gain 3 life. I think this is surprisingly not terrible, but I also think it's not good. It might be a sideboard card if your opponent has a escape bomb, like Elspeth say. You can maybe main deck it, as it's probably going to cantrip at some point, and you might be able to draw 2. But I don't think I would main deck it if I had like any other escape card, and maybe even if I didn't. It's going to be kind of hard to draw 2 off this, and like 1 mana cantrip is fine, but it's pretty do nothing. So I'm going to say D+. Yeah. Discordant Piper, 2 mana 2/1 that dies into an 0/1. That's not that bad, honestly. 2 mana 2/1 is not great, but dying into an 0/1 is, well, I think there's some sacrifice stuff in this set, or some stuff that triggers when your creatures die. And this can have a creature die twice by jumping or whatever. 2 mana, 2/1's okay. Zombie and Satyr might be relevant types. Having said that, it can't be that great. I'm going to give it a C minus. Drag to the Underworld. It's a 4 mana murder that costs X less, up to 2 less for as much devotion as you have. Yeah, this card's excellent. At 4 mana and limited, it would already be good. Often, by the time you want to cast this in an actual game of limited, you're usually going to have 1, if not 2 pips. So it's even going to be cheaper because you mostly want to kill bigger things that aren't super cheap. This card is excellent. This is like a B plus. Super premium removal. Eat to Extinction. Yeah, 4 mana to exile a creature planeswalker. Also very good in limited. And then you effectively get a surveil one. You get to look at the top and put it in your graveyard if you want, which is even a little bit better than, like more noticeably better than Scry in this set than in other sets because there is escape. And you could either mill an escape card and get some card advantage that way, or just help to fuel your other escape, or leave it on top if it's particularly good, right? Yeah, this is also like a B plus. It's probably a little bit worse than Drag to the Underworld because Drag to the Underworld is going to be a little bit cheaper, but it's more splashable. If you're not heavy black, then it's better. Regardless, you're not going to have to choose between them too often. Yeah. Elspeth's Nightmare, 3 mana saga. You get to destroy a small creature an opponent controls. You get to duress them, and then you exile your opponent's graveyard. If your first 2 modes hit, this is a 2-for-1, but the first mode can miss, and the second mode can miss. The third chapter is not that exciting to me. Probably you can get a little more than one of the first 2 modes to hit most of the time, but the first 2 chapters, I should say. But it's not like killing a creature that's that low power is all that exciting usually. It's not like duress is all that exciting usually. Altogether, it's probably decent. I'd give it like a C minus, probably a C. But I'm certainly not excited about this card. Let's move on to Enemy of Enlightenment. 6 mana, 5/5, flying enchantment creature demon. It gets -1/-1 for each card in your opponent's hand. Oof. At the beginning of your upkeep, each player discards a card. So you're making both of you empty-handed, which is, I guess, better for you? I'm not sure. 6 mana, 5/5 flyer is obviously very good, but it's rarely going to be a 5/5. By the time you cast it, your opponent's probably cast most of their hand, but they could easily have 2 cards in hand, at which point it's still only a 3/3, and they can start not playing their lands. Maybe you get them down to 1 card, and then it's a 4/4. And this card is okay, but I'm not super thrilled about it, I don't think. I'm going to give it a C? Maybe a C plus because you can build around the discarding stuff a little better than your opponent probably. But it's also kind of expensive, and you don't want too much that's expensive. I think I'm going to go with just regular C. If you don't have other expensive stuff, it gets better. If you do, it gets worse. If your opponents are going to be playing a lot of expensive stuff, it gets better. If your opponents are going to be playing a lot of draw, it gets worse. Although if your opponents are playing a lot of expensive stuff, it would seem like it would get better. But if your opponents are playing a lot of cheap stuff, then they're killing you, in which case it's worse. I don't know. I think if they're playing expensive stuff, it's better because while they are more likely to have more cards in their hand, you really want to make them discard stuff, I think. I don't know. It's a bit weird. Let's move on to Erebos. Erebos is again, same thing, needs devotion to 5 to black to be a creature. Indestructible 5/6 for 4 mana. Whenever another creature you control dies, you may pay 2 life if you do draw a card. That is a good ability. And you can pay 2 and sack a creature to give another creature -2/-1 until end of turn, which is not the best thing ever, but if you're like, that enables you to draw cards, so that's pretty nice. And you can do the old chump and shrink thing. You can do the I'm gonna block your guy and then sack another guy thing. You can do the our toughnesses are higher than our power, so our creatures bounce, and then I sack something to kill your guy. That doesn't really help, I guess. It's mostly just like block and sack something else, or chump and then sack it to shrink maybe another attacking creature, and then you get to draw 2 cards or draw a card and gain 2, lose 2 life. Yeah, pay 2 life. You probably can't do that a ton of times in limited because your life total tends to be a little bit under pressure, but you might be able to do it 3 times in a game fairly reasonably, and 3 extra cards is great. I guess sacrificing stuff is a little bit counterproductive to your devotion to making this guy on, but I'm not that worried about it. I think this is probably the best of the gods we've seen so far, and I want to give it an A minus, I think. Erebos' Intervention. Instant for X and a black. You're almost always using the first mode of target creature getting -X/-X until end of turn and gaining X life. Exiling a bunch of cards from your graveyards. Look, if your opponent has an escape bomb, it's nice to be able to do this. If your opponent doesn't have an escape bomb, you're never using the second mode. So you're basically just getting the first mode here, but the first mode is pretty good. It's not great. It's a little bit inefficient, right? Your opponent, right? We've seen a number of, say, 4 mana 3/4s in this format. So this would be like 5 mana to kill the thing, and you gain 4 life, which is a fine deal for 5 mana, but it's not like super exciting. On the other hand, you could use it as a combat trick too. You don't need to totally kill them with this thing, right? You only have 3 mana up. You can give them -2/-2 until end of turn, and then combine it like with a creature to eat things. And then gaining the life is pretty nice. I think this is like a pretty good removal spell overall. About as good as your big common removal spell probably will be. You can also kill a small thing for cheaper, and that flexibility is nice. Overall, I think this is like a B, probably, maybe a B minus. Probably B minus. Final Death, 5 mana exile target creature. Also B minus, I think. Like, this exiles, this does -X/-X, there's not much difference there. This has to be 5 mana. This is more flexible. This has an easier time killing big things. Maybe this is I think Erebos' Intervention is a little better because the life gain mostly, but they're very close. They're very close to the same card, honestly, in limited. I think I would rather have Erebos' Intervention. Let's call this a B minus. Maybe this is a B. Fruit of Tyzirus. Black for target player loses 2 life, and you can escape for 3 and a black. Unplayable and limited, it's an F. Funeral Rites. I mean, just losing 2 life, even repeatably, you can do it maybe 3 times in a game. It's just not enough. Funeral Rites. You draw 2, lose 2, and put the top 2 cards of your library into your graveyard. This is not as good as Read the Bones, because you'd rather scry 2 than mill 2. But mill 2 is an upside in this set with escape. And Read the Bones is pretty good anyway. This is probably like a C. C plus maybe, if the format is conducive to it. Gravebreaker Lamia. 5 mana 4/4 lifelink. I'm in. When it enters the battlefield, search your library for a card, put it into your graveyard, then shuffle your library. I'm in, because you just need to have any escape card for this to effectively be tutoring for that. You need to stock your graveyard enough to be able to escape it, but like you're often going to be able to do that, right? So like 1 in your deck makes this go up a lot. 2 in your deck makes this go up a lot. The third one in your deck doesn't help this much. If you already have all your escape cards, you could just search for like a basic land to take it out of your deck. You already have 5 mana by the time you have this. You probably don't want too many more lands. So you take your worst land out of your deck, and that's like some very small upside. but you don't need big upside, right? The spells from your graveyard cost 1 less to cast. Most of these escape costs, mana costs, are not that expensive, so that's not the biggest deal, but hey, it helps. But the lifelink is the big deal. 5 mana 4/4 lifelink I just play anyway. This card is probably not great, but you don't have to build around it much for it to be quite good. I think I'm going to give it a B. Wouldn't be surprised if it's a B plus, but I'm going to give it a B for now. Grey Merchant of Asphodel, Gary's back. 5 mana 2/4 ETBs to drain your opponent for X, where X is your devotion to black, right? That effect is just pretty good and better than you would think. Like 8-point life swings, not at all uncommon. You only need 4 devotion to black, and Gary gives you 2. And that's just a lot of life swing. And then 2 mana, 2/4 is, well, it's not a great body for 5 mana, but you had this big ETB effect. So yeah, this card is good. It's probably like a B minus. I don't think it's like super fantastic. I'm not sure whether I would take it over, say, these removal spells. So I think B minus is appropriate. It's about in that level, I think. Grim Physician, 1 mana 1/1. When it dies, target creature an opponent controls gets -1/-1 till end of turn. Card doesn't seem very good. It's quite good if your opponent has a lot of X1s, so you definitely want to bring it in then, because you could maybe even get a 2-for-1 out of this. If they have X2s, I mean, you can trade for an X2 with it by blocking. But overall, just like the Mud Mana 1/1 nature of it is just too weak, I think. So I'm going to give this a D. Hateful Eidolon, 1 mana 1/2 lifelink enchantment creature. Whenever an enchanted creature dies, draw a card for each aura you control that was attached to it. I don't want to be incentivized to be playing auras that I don't want to play anyway. So then it becomes about how many auras was I playing anyway. And it just really hasn't seemed like there have been that many given the set. And from what we've seen so far, well, I think this card isn't very good. It's like a D minus. If this were the original Theros block where we had Bestow, it would be a totally different story. But it's not. Inevitable End. Well, here's another aura. Enchanted creature has, at the beginning of your upkeep, sacrifice a creature. So you stick this on their good thing. They can either just make this be a delayed till their next upkeep removal spell, like a murder, that even gets around indestructible. Or they can, if the creature is good enough and the game isn't going to last long enough, they can choose to, get rid of something else. So best case, this is like a slightly delayed murder. But worst case, it just makes them sacrifice a creature every turn, which is probably worse than just killing whatever this was on, but they get the choice as to whether to do that or not, right? 3 mana murder would be good. Them getting the choice makes this worse. It being delayed makes it a tiny bit worse. It's probably still good though. Like, all of the options are bad enough for most opponents in most situations. This card is probably still kind of good. I'm going to give it a C plus B minus. I think it's worse than those other removal spells we saw earlier though, because of the flexibility your opponent gets. Lampad of Death's Vigil. 2 mana 1/3 enchantment creature, Nymph. You can pay 1 and sack a creature to drain each opponent for 1. Okay, if there are more sack themes than we've seen so far, this card is good. If the 1/3 body is relevant, this card is okay. Mostly I think this card is not that good, but it's probably like a D+. Minions Return. 3 mana aura. When an enchanted creature dies, return that card to the battlefield under your control. So you really want to take advantage of the flash on this, which is kind of hard to do. If you get a ton of these, then this Hateful Eidolon, like, these are kind of two mediocre cards where they work really well together, but they're both not good enough, so I kind of don't like it. I think for Minions Return, I'm going to say it's probably not horrible, but I'm only going to give it a D+. Myra Triton, 2 mana, 2/1 Death Touch. I'm in. When it enters the battlefield, put the top 2 cards of your library in your graveyard, upside but small upside, and you gain 2 life, upside but small upside. Having said that, 2 mana 2/1 Death Touch with 2 small upsides, that's pretty good. That's like a B minus. Maybe only a C plus. Maybe only a C plus. Mire's Grasp, 2 mana, enchant creature. Enchanted creature gets -3/-3. This card is really good. Kills a lot of things and shrinks a lot of other things to where they're not super relevant. Works with Constellation, maybe works with Devotion, although it's a little bit hard because your opponent, it's either going to kill the thing or your opponent's going to like throw it under the bus if you really want the Devotion. So, Mogus's Favor, 2 mana, gives +2/+1 or +2/-1 in an aura, and you can escape it for 3. This might be okay, but I don't really like. If it was +2/+1, I'd actually like this card quite a bit. This +2/-1, your creature's gonna just trade too often, and that's not really what you want from your aura. You will get card disadvantage from this because your creature just trades too much, right? If you have a lot of evasive things, it gets better, but I'm still not tons high on it. Nightmare Shepherd, 4 mana, 4/4 flying. Whenever another non-token creature you control dies, you may exile it. If you do, create a token that's a copy of that creature, except it's a 1/1 and a nightmare in addition to its other types. This card is an A+. First of all, 4 mana, 4/4 flyer, extremely good already. It's an enchantment creature, a little bit easier to kill. Probably a downside on this creature, actually, because it's so good your opponent will want to kill it, like, no matter what. Not that big of a downside anyway. And then the ability, you get a 1/1. Just like, forget the abilities, right? But you get a 1/1 from each of your creatures dying, which is very good and limited. Just having extra 1/1s around helps with your go wide theme from white, helps with ETB effects, helps with just any abilities you have. You have a flyer, it's a 1/1 flyer. If you have whatever, it has all those abilities. If you have a Discordant Piper, then it dies into a 1/1 and an 0/1, and the 1/1 dies into another 0/1. You can really go off, right? Having said that, that's not tons of extra value. Like, the abilities on this stuff isn't that great. Just having 1/1s is fantastic. Is most of the value here, except really most of the value is just 4 mana 4/4 flyer, which is just great. I think this is an A+, one of the top few cards we've seen so far. Nyxborn Marauder, 4 mana 4/3, solid card, enchantment creature, 2 devotion. 4 mana is when you usually have double black anyway, and we've seen, I think, the best devotion payoff so far in black, although it is uncommon, in Gray Merchant. So yeah, this is like a C. Omen of the Dead, 1 mana flash enchantment like all these other omens, and it's a raised dead. And then you get to sack it and to scry 2 if you pay 3 mana, which is kind of whatever. 1 mana raised dead is typically not good enough, although in this format we may have a little bit more stuff in our graveyards, although there's a little bit more graveyard hate too. Not so clear. The flash is mostly relevant for the constellation stuff, but it's not nothing. Yeah, it's probably only okay. D+, C-. Farika's Libation. You can either edict your opponent for creatures or edict your opponent for enchantments. The nice thing here is if they've got enchantment creatures that are better than their worst creature, you can make them sack one of those probably. Although if they have an omen, and this card might be a reason that if your opponent's playing black to think about keeping your omens around, then you really don't want to make them edict an enchantment when they're just going to, sack their omen, and it's not a big deal because they already got the value off it. Edicts are generally not great. This one's probably a little bit better than normal because they're likely to have an enchantment creature that's better than their worst creature, but they're not that likely, and sometimes they're going to have an omen, so it can't be that much better than an edict for 3, which is like a D+, I think, for this card. Okay, for Rika's Spawn, 4 mana 3/4, pretty good. Escapes for 6 and exiling only 3 other cards, and escapes with 2 1/1 counters. And when it enters the battlefield, This way, each opponent sacrifices a non-Gorgon creature. So 4 mana 3/4 is pretty solid. The escape power on this is so good that you get a 6 mana 5/6 as an extra card. You can probably, it only costs 3 cards from your graveyard, and by the time this has died, good chance you have 6 mana and another 3 cards in your graveyard. You get a 5/6 that edicts your opponent. Like, we just talked about edicts not being great, but when it's tacked on to a 6 mana 5/6 that was already itself card advantage, this card is very good. I think this card is a B. When Rage-Scarred Berserker enters the battlefield, target creature you control gets +1/+0 and indestructible until end of turn. It's a 5-drop if you need a 5-drop. 5 mana 5/4 is fine, and the ability is nice, I guess, but mostly you need to have a creature that has big enough power anyway that you can't be blocked. But often you're going to have that, and so then they can't trade with it. So it's going to get a pretty decent chunk of damage in. This is probably a C, maybe a C minus just because it's a 5-drop. Looks like one of the better 5-drops we've seen so far, but like 5-drops are usually not what you're hurting for in limited decks. Scavenging Harpy, 3 mana 2/1 flyer, reasonable generally. When it enters the battlefield, exile target card from an opponent's graveyard. That is real upside in the set with escape, although it's not that huge upside. I expect most decks to have like 1 to 2 escape cards. If you can nail the escape card, it's great. Otherwise, it maybe makes them wait a little bit longer to escape. This card is like a C, but that's mostly just because it's a 3 mana 2/1 flyer. Might be a C minus even still, because 3 mana 2/1 flyer isn't great. But I think flying is generally a pretty good ability, and then this gives it enough that I think I'm going to give it a C instead of the C minus/C that I would normally give a 3 mana 2/1 flyer. Soul Reaper of Mogis, 3 mana 2/3, and you can pay 2, or you can pay 3 and sack a creature to draw a card. That effect we saw in a card from War of the Spark, and it was quite good there. We've got this mini sacrifice sub-theme in black, but mostly just like, chump and sack is good. Sack to get around removal is good. It's a pretty decent ability to have on an already okay body. So I think this card is like a C, maybe even a C+. Temple Thief, 2 mana 2/2. Can't be blocked by enchanted creatures or enchantment creatures. 2 mana 2/2 is okay, and then this is a little bit hard to block, although not that hard to block probably. This is like a C. Normally a 2 mana 2/2 is like a C minus. I think this ability puts it up to a C. It can block enchantment or enchanted creatures. That's actually, sorry. If it couldn't block them, then it would be like a downside probably overall. It can block them, it just can't be blocked by them. So that's an upside, and that makes it a C. Treacherous Blessing. When it enters the battlefield, draw 3. Whenever you cast a spell, you lose a life. When it becomes the target of a spell or ability, sacrifice it. Well, 3 mana draw 3 is great. Having to pay a life every time you cast a spell is not. But how many more spells are you going to be casting this game? You're going to want to not cast this till late. And then, like, once you've emptied the rest of your hand, probably. Which means that this can't find you your key missing land drops, which is a big knock against it. But if you've already emptied your hand before you cast this, then you're probably only casting maybe 3 more spells in the game, because you're going to find about that many. Maybe 4. It's going to cost you 3 or 4 life, which isn't nothing. If you can target it, then that's good. If you have to cast a spell to target it, then it's kind of like this only drew 2 net, effectively. So that's a little bit worse. I think this card is actually kind of comparable to the 3 mana draw 2 we saw earlier. And I think it's a little bit worse even because unless there's some way you have like to target it with an activated ability, in which case it goes way up. If you can do that with any kind of regularity, or sacrifice it or something, right? I don't know if we've seen much that sacrifices enchantments rather than just creatures. But overall, I think it's a little bit worse than that other card because you're going to end up taking enough damage, especially since the big thing being that that card is fine to cast on turn 3 and this card is not. So you can't find missing lands with it nearly as well, which is a big part of, your 3-drop draw spell. So I think this makes this like a C minus. Timurat Calls the Dead. It's 3 mana. It's a saga. It makes two 2/2s, and then you gain X and scry X, where X is the number of zombies. There have actually been a reasonable number of other zombies to where that third ability is somewhat relevant and limited. That's quite a substantial scry, probably, because you're going to have the 2 zombies from this, probably. And 3 mana for 2/2/2s with more upside is pretty good card. I think this is like a B. Timuret, it's another 2-star demigod. The devotion is the toughness in this case. And you can pay 2 and exile up to 2 target cards from graveyards. Gain 1 life for each creature card exiled this way. Yeah, this is probably about as good as the white one. Maybe a little better because the graveyard hate is kind of real. And you can gain life with this just like with that. It's very comparable to the white one, I think. I think that I give this a C plus probably. Underworld Charger is a 3 mana 3/3 that can't block. Escapes for 5 and exiling 3 other cards, and it escapes as a 5/5. 3 mana 3/3 can't block is okay. The escape is nice. I think this is like a C plus if you have no other escape cards, down to a C minus if you have very many other escape cards. So overall, probably a C. Underworld Dreams is black, black, black for an enchantment that hits your opponent for 1 whenever they draw a card. It's a very slow win con. If you have if you're mono black and have multiple gray merchants somehow, this card is probably good. You really want the devotion, right? If you don't, it's a really slow win con. I think it's like a D minus, and you really need to have the deck that really wants a lot of devotion before you play this. Venomous Hierophant, 4 mana 3/3 Death Touch Gorgon. When it enters, you mill 3 from your deck. Yeah, this is a perfectly reasonable card. Death Touch means it's never going to be too bad. 3/3 means that your opponent, and Death Touch means your opponent can't probably double block with it. Double block it very profitably. They're going to lose both their things. Like 2/2/2s are both going to die to this. And then if they have a bigger thing, it's probably just going to trade 1 for 1. 4 mana, you're probably not really trading down on mana. You're probably not trading up on mana by a ton, but the milling yourself is a little nice. We've seen a couple of good escape creatures, this uncommon and this common in black, so it looks like they have a little more escape than otherwise. We're about to see this rare as well. So the milling is a little bit better in black than it otherwise would be. Yeah, I think this is just a solid C. Maybe it's a C plus, and if the more you escape you have, it gets to be a little better. But I think mostly it's just a C. Woe Strider's a 3 mana 3/2 that makes an 0/1. You can sacrifice another creature to scry 1, which is mostly going to be the 0/1 and or something you're chumping with. Can't sacrifice itself, which is important to note, but it has escape 5. With 4 other cards, you can escape it, and it comes back as a 5/4. Super solid card. The sacrifice stuff, I don't think you're actually hurting for sacrifice effects in these colors. The Scry 1 as a bonus is not that great. We haven't seen so many payoffs for sacking stuff. So I don't think this card is great. I'm much more interested in it constructed, but it's still like perfectly good and solid. 3 mana 3/2 that you can probably get back later as a 5/4 is just a good card, and it comes with an 0/1 each time. The Scry and the sacrifice is a nice upside. So I think it's good, but I'm not super thrilled about it. I think escape is very good, so I'm going to give this a B minus. I think it's not quite as good as this Gorgon, but it's still good. And that does it for black. See you soon with red.